episode in this series of videos covering AQA's GCSE History Unit, America, Opportunity and Inequality. If you haven't seen the previous 6 videos, I'd recommend going to the #HisTV YouTube channel and watching those first, looking at America during the 1920s and 1930s. Today, we're going to have a look at the key question: what was the impact of World War II on American society? For those of you that have studied America during the Great Depression in the 1930s, you'll know that President Roosevelt and his New Deal started to help America recover, but actually America did not fully recover until World War II. So we're going to have a look at why World War II really was a time of big recovery for America. We're also going to have a look at the impact that war had on American society generally, but specifically on 2 groups of people: Black Americans, soldiers and workers, and then also women as well. Now, there are 5 key areas that I'm going to cover in this video looking at the impact of World War II on American society. We're going to start by looking at wartime production. We're going to have a look at the economic recovery that led to in America. We're also going to have a look at the changing priorities of American businesses and how they helped America with their war effort as well. And then we're going to have a look at the experience of 2 groups, the experience of Black Americans, and then the changing role of women and their experience of wartime America. Let's begin by looking at wartime production then. Now, we know that in the 1920s, America developed a style of mass production that allowed them to make products that were exported all across the world. When World War II started in 1939, most Americans wanted to avoid direct fighting. This was known as isolationism. America, though, helped their allies through something called the Lend-Lease program. And this is where America sent weapons, food, and medicine to nations fighting against Germany. And it was agreed that this would be returned after the war. That's where the words lend and lease come in. Now, during this time, $50.1 billion worth of material was sent, and this boosted American business dramatically. There was also a sense of patriotism in American business. Business owners supported Roosevelt and America's war effort. And so because of this, Roosevelt was able to raise taxes and spend freely to win the war. We know from previous videos that Roosevelt believed in an active government, a government that actively spent to get out of crisis, and Roosevelt was able to rely on the American people to help him. By 1944, the USA was making almost half of all weapons being made globally. More workers were needed because of this. And so 4 million people migrated from the rural south to the industrial north, where they could find factories. And so this wartime production was escalating throughout the years of World War II. So we've looked at wartime production. Let's have a look at the economic recovery this led to in America. America came out of World War II with the strongest economy in the world, and they had now fully recovered from the Great Depression. 500,000 new businesses had opened during the war. Massive companies that we still have today, like Coca-Cola and Wrigley's, were given big contracts and made lots of money as a result. And the war really ended unemployment, reduced unemployment to a very, very low level. During the war, America exported food to its allies as part of Lend-Lease, and farmers enjoyed much better times as the value of their produce grew. If you think back to previous videos in your study of America in the 1920s and 1930s, you know that farmers went through quite a difficult period of time. So this led to a recovery in the farming industry. Finally then, America's economy started to grow during the war. Many Americans invested in something called war bonds, where they paid money to the government, paying $129 billion in total, and the government promised them that it would be paid back after the war. It's a way of raising money during a war. And this money from war bonds was invested in production, in factories, in business, and so it boosted the economy further. There's a general sense of the American people all working together through paying war bonds to help America recover and win the war. Lots of businesses also changed priorities in this time. So many American companies stopped making their normal products and produced goods for the war instead, which further supported the war, but also further boosted American industry and the economy. Something called the War Production Board, or WPB, was set up in 1942. The owners of big factories, people known as industrialists, advised Roosevelt on how they could produce the goods needed for war. And so around 100 American firms and companies were given big contracts to make these products. And again, this boosted American business. Government spending increased dramatically from $20 billion in 1941 to 97.2 billion in 1944, a very big increase. Taxes also increased in America, and people were persuaded to invest their money in war bonds. And so most Americans supported Roosevelt's active government. They were getting behind their president and their government's policies. Finally then, in December 1941, Germany declared war on America, and Japanese warplanes attacked at Pearl Harbor. America really was forced to end this period of isolationism where they keep themselves out, and so they joined the war. And America was now getting involved in the war, having helped the other nations through the Lend-Lease program. We've thought more generally about the impact of war on America. We thought about wartime production and the economic recovery it caused, and then the changing priorities of American business. Let's zoom in and focus on the experience of two different groups of people now. Let's start with the experience of Black Americans. Over 1 million Black Americans joined the armed forces during World War II and worked alongside white soldiers, although the American army was segregated, split into units of Black and white soldiers. Now, many American troops were based in Britain and experienced a society that was not segregated by race. In Britain, there were not segregation laws officially. Now, they experienced a much better society. They experienced a society where white and Black people could get along, although some Black troops that went out with white women did feel and experience tension in British communities. But Black Americans, particularly in Britain, had a better experience and saw society could work without segregation. Back in America itself, 2 million Black Americans worked in American munitions factories. Many Black Americans migrated from the rural South to the industrial North and did experience generally a more tolerant and integrated society. And so these experiences of the army, particularly in Britain, and then also the less segregated North, I should say, this fired the Black American people up to think about fighting for their rights. Membership of a group called the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Coloured People, rose from 50,000 to 500,000 during the war, and the NAACP was the main organisation campaigning for equal rights. And we will see this organisation start to be mentioned more and more as we talk about the growing civil rights movement in the 1950s in later videos. Now, many Black Americans hoped that American society would change after the war rather than returning to normal. Remember, they're fighting against Hitler who was trying to wipe out an entire race of people. Also, they were fighting for freedom and equality. And so there was this feeling generally from Black Americans and from some white Americans as well, that if they were fighting for that thousands of miles away, they should be fighting for that back in America as well. So that's the experience of Black Americans. Let's also then finish by looking at the changing role of women and their experience of World War II. During World War II, many women took on the jobs left behind by the men that were going to war. A third of aircraft workers were women, and they were often given difficult and fiddly jobs because women generally were smaller and more agile. Half of the workers in munitions factory were women, and so 60% of American factory managers reported and said that women were their best workers. Women were gaining experience of work that they perhaps had not received before this time. 200,000 women also joined the armed forces, and many other women joined a group called the Red Cross, so they're experiencing some kind of work in the military as well. Now, when male soldiers returned from the war, they expected women just to leave their jobs and return to their pre-war lives. But many women during World War II had experienced better wages and more independence, and they were not willing to go back to their pre-war lives either. And so there's a sense that war really was a trigger point for the beginning or the origins of what we call the feminist movement, women looking for equality between the genders, and we'll see that start to escalate, particularly at the end of the 60s and early 70s in later videos in this course. So there we have it. We've talked about the impact of World War II. We talked about wartime production and how America used the Lend-Lease program to support its allies, but also to generate economic recovery. We've talked about the changing priorities of American businesses, leaving behind their old products in order to make things that are going to help America's war effort. And then we've zoomed in on the experience of Black Americans and the experience of women during World War II, and how their different experience maybe persuaded or inspired them to start a movement to fight for their equality back in America. Thanks for watching.